There's been very little, if any, decline in the subjective dimension of religious belief. So they say, yes, sociologists often talk about Europe having lower rates of religious participation. Not many people go to church and the churches are empty. But they say, well, there's reasons for that. Europe was never fully Christianized, so we can't really say that anything's fallen apart if it was never really thickly Christianized. It was this lazy monopoly. And not only that, they say, people still seem to report these subjective measures of religiousness. And then finally, and this is where they, at some level, really kind of take their hacks at sociologists that support the secularization theory. They say there is no conflict between religion and science, and they marshal all sorts of arguments. They say many scientists are in fact religious. Religion didn't disappear in the Soviet Union, so despite decades, maybe 70 years of intentional atheistic teachings and anti-religious teachings, religion never disappeared in what was supposed to be the most scientifically rational communist state. They say, actually, if you look at examples from Islam, there seems to be a connection between increased education and increased belief in religion, which is opposite of what the secularization theorists would say. And finally, they'd say it just doesn't seem that science causes doubt. So there's been no long-term overturning of religion amongst the whole population from the Enlightened period on. It just doesn't seem that there's a necessary conflict between religion and science. So these are their strong polemical arguments in saying, in their mind, that secularization theory is completely useless. Now, what I'm going to present to wrap up this section is to say secularization, what I call a middle path. In other words, kind of weighing the arguments and seeing what's useful. The first and maybe most important point to make in all this is that secularization theory has looked for kind of a historical pattern that was bound to happen to religion in the modern era. That has been proved untrue. However, what we can say is that there have been and there are changes that occur in religion according to historical place and time. And it's the parts of secularization theory that can talk about these changes which are most interesting. For example, in the United States, there has been some small decline in religious belief and weekly religious participation. Part of this might be the fact that in the US nowadays, people are much less social pressured into saying, yeah, I believe in God, or yeah, I go to church every week. In other words, it's more legitimate these days to say no to those survey questions when they say, do you believe in God or do you go to church? And so that's kind of interesting. So there may not have been a quote-unquote change then in belief and participation. It might have been over-reported decades ago. But we can say now that there has been some change in society in order for people to be comfortable saying that their behaviors and beliefs aren't what they were reported to have been decades ago. So there's been some small decline in that way. And then in Europe, the decline that's really happened since World War II, especially in terms of religious participation, has to do with very distinct historical relationships in Europe. So as Finke and Stark told us, for a long time the church and state were united in Europe, and that sort of close connection between the two and lack of religious diversity may have something to do with the fact that religious rates in Europe are nowhere near as high as they are in the United States. However, what's important to point out is that the United States might be kind of a special case of historical and sociological circumstances where religion has often been a very legitimate part of civil society. It hasn't been much connected to church and state, though we'll talk about that in future weeks. But what's important to point out is that if we look at kind of nations and differences in religious activity, secularization theory in this middle path that I'm talking about points us to looking at the historical reasons, the political reasons, the social reasons why we'll see differences in religion in this modern era. So no longer is it one grand theory about the modern era will cause religion to go this way. Instead, we look at more kind of the configurations in time and place that may cause religion to seem to be either less strong or less present. And then a biggie in terms of this middle path, and you'll remember the other day this diagram I drew where once upon a time we think religion was kind of this overarching bringing together of economy and politics and society. Well, whether this was fully true or not, and Finke and Stark give us some reason to whether it was ever that coherent. It was true that religious authority, so the power of was very strong in other realms. So one piece of secularization theory that has been borne out, or I would say is coherent, is this idea of institutional differentiation. Okay. And I talked about a little bit of that last time. So this does seem to be one place where secularization has occurred. So religious authority is not the dominant voice when you make your stock market decisions, when you go to the doctor, when you make your voting decisions. That ability of one organization or certain religious leaders to have authority is just not the case anymore. And it's in all spheres of our social life. So this institutional differentiation does seem to have been a way that religion has changed. Notice I didn't say die out, but instead it's changed, it's shifted in this modern era. And then what's important, one other kind of part of what I call this middle path in regard to secularization theory, is that we now know that there has been no natural, inevitable shift that occurs because of the introduction of science or rationalized thinking in the last 300 years. There are some places, for example, a college sociology faculty, or maybe in an earlier time some natural science divisions within a college, where people tended to be less religious than the main population. So there is some connection there. But in general, there is no natural, inevitable, logical connection between scientific thinking and advanced education and a decline in religious belief or religious behaviors. And then finally, what I would end by saying is that there has been some, and I alluded to this last time, privatization of religious belief and behavior. So as I've said before, this idea of I'm spiritual but not religious, or I have my own religious beliefs, I don't need to go to a church. Those are indications of religious change in the modern era, particularly in the United States in the last couple of decades. It doesn't mean religion has evaporated or religion has died out, but instead that religion has changed in terms of how individuals appropriate it, in terms of where they see religious authority more kind of within themselves, within their own interpretations of religious ideas now, instead of potentially coming from religious leaders. So this is a way of saying that in secularization theory there's lots of areas of gray, that there's no one overarching narrative about secularization. But as I've tried to show here, that I do think there is some kind of middle path to what she can tell us about change in the modern era. Okay, so I'm kind of going through the secularization argument, and I want to end and say, so this is kind of the last topic for the first half of our course, and let me kind of give you a quick review of what I see as the main themes in the course to kind of help you have some hooks to hang your studying on over the weekend. So we have discussed right from the get-go how the sociological study of religion is different. We determined really quickly in this class that we weren't going to be judging religious behavior or asking what religious behavior is more true, but instead we are going to be using the tools of sociological process, such as looking at groups, looking at deviant behavior, looking at socialization processes. We're going to use all of these things to try and understand religion during the course of this semester. Then, early on in the course, we discussed some basic categories, particularly of American religion, as well as some basic statistics of American religion. We looked at some ways that American religion is organized, denomination, religious tradition, that sort of thing. We looked at different ways to measure religion. Remember the classic 5 ways of measuring religion that I lectured about.